Tonight we are not talking about nuclear threats. We are not talking about red lines. We are not even talking about World War III predictions. Tonight we are talking about how Russia's entire missile defense system collapsed like a house of cards in 30 minutes, and why the world's second most powerful military just learned that expensive doesn't always mean effective. Hello there, I'm Richard Maddow, and welcome to another round of Truth Uncomfortably Served. You know that feeling when you spend billions on the best security system money can buy, and then someone picks the lock with a paperclip? Yeah, grab your popcorn. Because when those first radar blips appeared over Bryansk at 3:42 in the morning, Russian operators saw what looked like a minor inconvenience. 14 to 16 slow-moving targets, flying so low they were practically mowing the grass, moving at speeds your grandmother's sedan could match on a good day. The kind of threat that makes you think someone ordered drones from the clearance section. Inside the Iskander maintenance zone, 3 massive launchers, each weighing more than a fully loaded semi-truck, were sitting offline for routine checks, fuel lines connected, rocket motors exposed, warheads just hanging out like it was a normal Tuesday. The site was considered secure because it sat over 90 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. You know, the kind of distance that feels safe until it suddenly isn't. One drone detached from the formation and decided to ruin everyone's morning by diving straight into a cluster of support vehicle. The impact was compact but violent enough to spike temperatures past 1,800 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to melt steel, vaporize confidence, and probably ruin the warranty on everything within 200 meters. 2 transloaders became very expensive paperweights. Hydraulic pressure went from operational to zero, faster than your interest in a timeshare presentation. One Iskander launcher was knocked so far out of alignment that field repair became a polite fiction. For 9 seconds, power flickered like a horror movie was about to start. And in a way, it was. To Russian command, this looked manageable. A localized strike, maybe a lucky shot, definitely something they could spin as no big deal. Pantsir S-1 batteries activated within 45 seconds. Radar gain cranked up. Interceptor crews told to expect more drones. Classic playbook. Except here's what they missed, while congratulating themselves on their response time. The strike didn't target missiles in storage. It hit during refueling, during maintenance, during the exact 12-minute window when safety margins were at their absolute lowest. Ukraine hadn't aimed for destruction. Ukraine had aimed for disruption. And disruption, my friends, is the gift that keeps on giving. As Bryansk scrambled to stabilize 1 damaged launcher and 2 disabled vehicles while pretending everything was fine, the larger picture remained invisible. This wasn't the main event. This was the opening act, the warm-up band before the headliner. And while Russian defenses locked onto Bryansk like it was the only threat in existence, the real countdown had already begun hundreds of kilometers away. It's like watching someone defend their front door while burglars are already in the kitchen making sandwiches. At 3:46 a.m., as Bryansk struggled with damage control and probably some very awkward phone calls, the sky over Kursk and Belgorod lit up with something far more alarming. Not a few targets, not a dozen. Over 70 signatures spreading across multiple sectors like a nightmare radar screen from a video game you're about to lose. Layered at different altitudes, drifting in from different bearings, basically showing up to the party uninvited and in large number. Russian crews didn't hesitate. Pantsir S-1 batteries snapped into action like they were auditioning for a defense contractor commercial. S-400 launchers elevated with all the confidence of a system that costs more than a small country's GDP. Within minutes, interceptors were streaking into the night. Each missile carried a price tag hovering around $140,000 to $160,000. Professional-grade hardware, top-shelf stuff. And in less than 6 minutes, more than 80% of those very expensive interceptors were gone, spent on targets that barely cost $700 apiece. Let that sink in. They burned through millions of dollars shooting at what were essentially flying decoys with GPS and delusions of grandeur. Because these weren't attack drones, they were bait. Clever little Corvo decoys flooding the airspace, broadcasting signatures tuned to look heavier, faster, and far more dangerous than they really were. Russian radars locked on like sharks smelling blood. Fire control systems committed with the enthusiasm of someone who hasn't read the fine print. The steel umbrella closed tight, exactly as planned. And while everyone's attention stayed fixed on the sky, watching the fireworks and feeling accomplished, the real movement happened below it. Classic misdirection. The kind magicians use, except with significantly higher stakes and explosion. Between the radar sweeps and missile launches, 16 to 18 actual strike drones slipped through at under 45 meters, using terrain masking and smoke clutter like they'd studied the manual Russian operators apparently skipped. Their target wasn't the launchers yet. That would be too obvious, too expected. Instead, they went for infrastructure, fuel distribution points, auxiliary power nodes, the unglamorous stuff that makes everything else work. One drone struck a secondary storage area, triggering a blast that pushed internal temperatures beyond 2,100 degrees Celsius and knocked out the reload cycle for 3 Iskander units. Not destroyed, just conveniently unavailable for the foreseeable future. To Russian commanders, this felt like success. Dozens of targets destroyed, the swarm broken, reports sent upward claiming control had been restored. Imagine sending your boss an email saying everything's fine, while the building is actively on fire. That's essentially what happened. By forcing Russia to exhaust interceptors and overtune radar sensitivity, Ukraine wasn't attacking strength. It was hollowing it out from the inside. Reaction time slowed. Systems overheated. Operators stayed locked in the same mental loop, fighting yesterday's war while tomorrow's war was already happening. And as Kursk and Belgorod declared the threat contained, probably with a degree of confidence that aged poorly, a far larger signal spike was already forming to the south. Because what was coming next wouldn't test the defensive, it would overwhelm them. And if you were sitting behind that radar screen, watching targets multiply faster than your budget could handle, would you wait or would you fire? Spoiler alert, they fired. And that was exactly the problem. At 3:57 a.m., Rostov was supposed to be ready, the poster child for preparedness. By the time alarms rippled north and west, local commanders had already elevated air defenses to maximum sensitivity. Radar gain pushed high enough to probably pick up migrating birds and ambitious mosquitoes. Engagement protocols loosened to the point where if it flew and looked suspicious, it was getting a missile with its name on it. Every screen glowed with confidence that this time, absolutely nothing would slip through. Confidence is a wonderful thing right up until reality shows up uninvited. In less than 40 seconds, 72 airborne objects entered the Rostov sector from 3 directions. Altitudes varied between 30 and 70 meters. Speeds were inconsistent. Signatures overlapped so much that to the radar, it didn't look like an attack. It looked like noise, too much of it. And here's where the math becomes painful. Pantsir S-1 systems can track roughly 24 targets at once. Rostov received 3 times that number. Fire control computers began cycling priorities like someone frantically switching browser tabs, constantly dropping one track to chase another. Operators launched interceptors anyway, because what else are you going to do when the manual doesn't cover this scenario? In under 4 minutes, more than $18 million worth of defensive missiles were expended into empty air. 18 million. That's enough money to fund a small city's annual budget, a nice yacht, or several lifetimes of therapy for whoever had to explain this expense report. While decoys pulled radar and guns upward like a magic trick that only works because everyone's looking in the wrong direction, 26 strike drones approached low and fast from the east, riding the clutter of industrial structures and rail yards like they owned the place. Their target was not the launchers themselves, because again, that would be too straightforward. The target was the heart of the logistics hub, fuel storage and transloader staging, the stuff that makes everything else possible. The first impact hit a pressurized fuel reservoir holding nearly 190,000 liters of solid propellant compounds. That's a lot of very explosive material sitting in one very unfortunate place. The second drone arrived 7 seconds later, because timing is everything in comedy and warfare. The blast did not peak once, it cascaded. Internal temperatures surged past 3,100 degrees Celsius, hot enough to make hell look like a sauna. The chain reaction propagated across the facility like dominoes made of thermite. Sensors recorded sustained explosions for 34 consecutive minutes. 34 minutes. That's longer than most sitcom episodes. Hangar doors tore free. Shockwaves fractured reinforced walls that were supposed to be, reinforced. Inside, 4 Iskander-M launchers were rendered non-operational in the technical sense of completely useless. 6 transloader vehicles, each essential for missile reloads, were destroyed where they stood. Hydraulic systems vaporized. Replacement timelines stretched from weeks into months, possibly years if you factor in procurement, shipping, and the kind of bureaucratic delays that make the DMV look efficient. By 4:02 a.m., Rostov had stopped transmitting coherent status reports. Power was intermittent. Communications dropped in and out like a bad cell signal in a tunnel. The logistics artery feeding the Donbass front was no longer functional. This was not a precision strike aimed at symbolism or sending a message. This was a systemic failure induced in real time. Rostov didn't fall because defenses were weak. It fell because they were overwhelmed at exactly the wrong moment, which is really the only moment that matters. As smoke climbed thousands of meters into the sky and thermal signatures lit up satellites across the region, like someone had started a bonfire visible from space, one truth became unavoidable. The operation had crossed a threshold, and the next targets were already listening, probably with increasing nervousness. At 4:01 a.m., as the fires in Rostov were still burning and someone was definitely getting fired in the metaphorical sense, command attention snapped south to Krasnodar. This was supposed to be different. Unlike the northern hubs that had already had a very bad morning, Krasnodar sat beneath one of the densest electronic defense umbrellas in the region. Operators believed this was where the line would finally hold, where the fortress would prove impenetrable, where expensive equipment would finally justify its price tag. Confidence was high. Reality had other plans. Krasnodar, 4 electronic warfare systems surged to extreme output, flooding the spectrum with wideband interference. Signal density spiked by nearly 60% in under a minute. GPS reception collapsed across a 45-kilometer radius. To Russian crews, it felt like sealing the battlefield inside an invisible wall, an electronic fortress, impenetrable. Except here's the thing about building walls: sometimes you trap yourself inside. The intensity of the jamming began to suffocate Krasnodar's own sensors. S-400 radars struggled to separate real returns from their own reflected noise. Track confidence dropped sharply. Fire control systems hesitated like someone second-guessing a bad decision in slow motion. The fortress wasn't silent. It was screaming too loudly to hear anything else. It's the military equivalent of shouting so loud you can't hear someone knocking on your door. Into that noise came 31 low observable drones built from composite materials with minimal metal content. Their radar signatures fell below 0.01 square meters, which in technical terms means basically invisible to systems expecting metal targets. Instead of fighting the jamming, they leaned into it. Passive guidance systems homed in on the Krasnodar's emissions, using the strongest interference as a beacon rather than an obstacle. It's like following someone who's screaming, "You'll never find me," at the top of their lungs. At 4:04 a.m., the first drone crossed the perimeter undetected. Within seconds, impacts followed across the staging area like a very organized disaster. 3 Iskander-M launchers were struck while parked nose to tail, engines idle, cooling systems exposed, basically in the worst possible configuration for surviving an attack. Thermal sensors recorded localized spikes exceeding 2,800 degrees Celsius. Hydraulic reservoirs ignited. Control electronics failed simultaneously in what engineers call a catastrophic cascade, and what everyone else calls a very expensive problem. Nearby missile-handling vehicles burned through their structural frames, disabling 5 transloaders in less than a minute. Communications collapsed almost immediately. Fiber lines overheated. Backup radios drowned in interference. For 11 full minutes, Krasnodar went dark on the regional command map. Just disappeared. Gone. Like it had decided to take an unscheduled break from being a functional military installation. What had been designed as an electronic shield became an electronic blindfold. As smoke settled over the base and emergency crews struggled to regain basic control, probably while questioning their career choices, the implications were unavoidable. The strongest defensive node in the network had neutralized itself. It didn't need an enemy to defeat it. It just needed to be used exactly as designed, which apparently was the design flaw no one anticipated. And with Krasnodar offline, only one major stronghold remained untouched: Crimea. the crown jewel, the untouchable fortress, the place Russian planners had described for years as impenetrable. And if you've been paying attention to how this story has been going, you can probably guess what happened next. At 4:10 a.m., by the time Krasnodar fell silent, and someone in command was having a very bad day that was about to get worse, Crimea stood alone. For years, Russian planners had described the peninsula as untouchable, not just defended, untouchable. A layered fortress guarded by overlapping S-400 and Tor M2 batteries, reinforced by coastal radar and constant patrols. Confidence rested on density, on coverage, on redundancy. The kind of confidence that comes from looking at a spreadsheet instead of reality. Nothing was supposed to get through. And we all know what happens when military planners use the word supposed. The approach did not come from the sky they expected, because at this point, why would anything be expected? A single F-16 Block 50 entered low along the coastline, masked by terrain and sea clutter, holding altitude below 45 meters at speeds near 1,400 kilometers per hour. It was not there to strike. It was there to open space, to be the key that unlocks the door so everyone else can walk through. At 4:12 a.m., electronic pods came alive, flooding multiple bands with focused interference. Not the blanket jamming that Krasnodar used to such disastrous effect, but surgical, targeted, professional. Seconds later, two AGM-88 HARM missiles separated and surged ahead, homing on active radar emissions like heat-seeking missiles, except they seek radar instead of heat. Russian crews faced a binary choice, the kind that shows up in training scenarios and nightmares: stay online and risk interception, or power down and lose visibility. Both options are terrible. Welcome to modern warfare. Within moments, several emitters went dark. The defensive picture fractured like a mirror someone dropped. That fracture was the signal, the green light. The moment everything had been building toward. 10 Corvo decoys entered first, pulling fire and attention inland like the opening act everyone's seen before. Autocannons engaged at full rate, burning through ammunition on targets that cost less than the bullets being used to shoot them. Short-range interceptors chased false returns, while defenses focused forward, doing exactly what they were trained to do, which was exactly the problem. While defenses focused forward, 6 Neptune cruise missiles skimmed the Black Sea at under 4 meters above the surface, hidden in spray and curvature, using the Earth's natural geometry as camouflage. Their approach vectors converged on Hangar 12, the central staging site for the Crimean Missile Group, the place where everything important was kept, because centralization is efficient right up until it becomes a single point of failure. At 4:15 a.m., the first impacts landed. 2 missiles struck the doors at high speed with the kind of kinetic energy that makes structural engineering irrelevant. 4 more followed through the roofline, because why use one entrance when you can make several? Inside the structure, 6 Iskander-M launchers sat fully loaded, warheads staged, fuel lines connected, everything ready to go except for the minor detail of being inside a building that was currently being demolished. The resulting reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Thermal readings peaked above 3,200 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than the surface of most stars in our immediate cosmic neighborhood. Pressure waves tore through reinforced concrete like it was drywall. Secondary detonations propagated across the complex for nearly 10 minutes, each one adding to a chain reaction that probably violated several laws of physics and definitely violated the warranty. By the time the fire subsided, and someone could actually see through the smoke, 5 transloader vehicles were destroyed, and the Crimean Missile Group ceased to function as an organized force. Satellite sensors tracked a thermal plume rising over 800 meters, visible far beyond the peninsula. The kind of signal you can't hide, can't spin, can't explain away with creative terminology. The fortress had not been stormed. It had been unlocked from the inside, walked through, and left burning. At 4:25 a.m., by the time dawn approached and someone had to start writing reports that no one wanted to read, the map no longer resembled a defense network. Bryansk, Kursk, Rostov, Krasnodar, and Crimea were all reporting partial or total loss of missile readiness. What connected them was not geography, but timing. The entire sequence from first contact to final impact had unfolded in just over 30 minutes. 30 minutes. That's less time than it takes to watch a single episode of most streaming shows. Less time than most people's morning commute. Less time than it takes to have a productive meeting. though admittedly this was significantly more productive than most meetings. The numbers were unforgiving, the kind that make accountants weep and generals reconsider their assumptions. Across 5 regions, 11 to 13 Iskander-M launchers were rendered non-operational. 17 transloader vehicles were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Multiple fueling points and maintenance bays were disabled simultaneously. Replacement timelines were no longer measured in days or weeks, but in months. Some components would require factory-level reconstruction, assuming the factories could even produce them fast enough, which is a generous assumption. Cost assessments began circulating almost immediately, because someone always has to calculate how expensive the disaster was. Conservative estimates placed equipment losses between $2.6 and $3.1 billion. That's billion with a B. The kind of money that could fund entire national programs, build infrastructure, or apparently go up in smoke in half an hour. The defending side had expended hundreds of high-value interceptors and thousands of rounds of autocannon ammunition, turning their defensive budget into what financial analysts might call a suboptimal investment. In contrast, the attacking force relied primarily on low-cost airframes, decoys, and a limited number of precision weapons, an imbalance that reshaped the exchange ratio beyond anything planners had anticipated. It's like showing up to a gunfight with calculators and somehow winning because you did the math better. More damaging than the material loss was the operational pause. Missile brigades that had been prepared for sustained launches were forced offline. Command and control nodes struggled to re-establish clean data links. For several hours, long-range strike capacity across the southern and western sectors was sharply reduced. This was not achieved by overwhelming force. This was not achieved by superior numbers or bigger explosions. It was achieved by sequencing, by understanding that modern warfare isn't about destroying everything, it's about interrupting the right things at the right time. Each strike hit a different layer of the system: maintenance, refueling, logistics, electronic defense, command. Never the same weakness twice in a row. Defensive responses arrived, but always one step behind the problem they were reacting to, like someone trying to catch a train that left 5 minutes ago. By 5 a.m., emergency crews were still assessing damage, while senior commanders tried to reconstruct how so many hardened sites had failed in parallel. The answer was already evident in the timelines for anyone willing to look at them honestly. The operation did not rely on surprise alone. It relied on predictability, of procedures, of reactions, of assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. The kind of assumptions that survive until someone tests them, and then they don't. In half an hour, a strategic balance shifted, not because everything was destroyed, because it wasn't, but because everything that mattered was interrupted at the same time. When the smoke cleared, the most important damage wasn't what burned on the ground. It was what stopped moving in the background. The invisible infrastructure, the logistics, the coordination, the rhythm. In just 30 minutes, a system built over years lost its rhythm. Launchers stood idle. Logistics froze. Command timelines fractured. Not because of one massive blow that everyone could point to and understand, but because dozens of small, precise decisions landed at exactly the wrong moment. This operation didn't rewrite the rules of war. It exposed them. It showed that modern conflict isn't decided by who has the biggest weapons, but by who understands timing, signals, and vulnerability better. Steel was not defeated by more steel. It was outpaced by coordination, by planning, by understanding that expensive systems have expensive weaknesses, and those weaknesses can be exploited by anyone who bothers to read the manual carefully enough. So here's the question worth thinking about, the one that should keep defense planners awake at night. If low-cost systems can dismantle billion-dollar arsenals this fast, what does deterrence even look like tomorrow? And if this can happen in 30 minutes to one of the most defended networks on the planet, how many other assumptions are still standing simply because they haven't been tested yet? Because this isn't just about Russia. This isn't just about Ukraine. This is about every military system that assumes complexity equals security, that assumes expensive means effective, that assumes yesterday's doctrine will work tomorrow. Those assumptions just got 30 minutes of very expensive testing, and they failed. This has been Richard Maddow bringing you Truth Uncomfortably Served. Drop your thoughts below, preferably before the next military revolution makes this one look quaint. Because the future of warfare just sent a message. And the message is that the future doesn't wait for permission.